Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. Our next guest, very pleased to have Professor Allen Guelzo. He's got a book out, Reconstruction, A Concise History. Now, about a year or so ago, you came out with a book about Gettysburg, and I happened to learn some new things about General Meade. So if I read Reconstruction, A Concise History, what am I going to learn?
Well, you'll learn, among other things, that Reconstruction is one of the most difficult and embarrassing periods in American history. It's something of the grim fairy tale stepchild, the ugly duckling of American history in the eyes of a lot of people, including American historians. Most of the time when people talk about Reconstruction, it's in terms of all the opportunities that were lost, all the embarrassing defeats, all the useless victories. It's not one of the more famous or more admirable chapters in our history. And yet, we probably live with the after effects of Reconstruction on a daily basis, almost more than any other era in American history.
For some listeners that are not fully familiar with the history of the Civil War and its aftermath, what was Reconstruction?
Well, in the strictest sense, Reconstruction was the program, if you can call it that, of the federal government to reintegrate the defeated Confederate states, the 11 Confederate states that formed the Southern Confederacy, back into the Union after their defeat in the Civil War. It's a period which we generally peg as lasting from 1865 to 1877. And maybe the modern parallel to it would be, for instance, the Marshall Plan for dealing with Germany after World War II, or even the variety of regime change plans that we attempted to implement in Iraq and Afghanistan after those conflicts from 2003 to 2006. We've been doing reconstructions in various places then. What we did in 1865 to 1877 was kind of the original pilot project of how to do a post-war reconstruction.
Now, when construction first started, Andrew Johnson was president. How did he handle it?
Badly. Andrew Johnson was never designed to be a president. He had been selected to run as Abraham Lincoln's vice president in 1864 when Lincoln was reelected, but no one seriously looked upon him as being presidential timber. He was added to the ticket largely to persuade Northern Democratic voters to vote for the Republican, Abraham Lincoln. When John Wilkes Booth's bullet silences Lincoln, automatically Johnson becomes president. And almost as automatically, two things become very clear. One is that Johnson is really not very good at this presidential thing. And the second thing is that Andrew Johnson is, after all, a Southern Democrat, a Tennessee Democrat. And most of his instinctive sympathies are very closely allied to the defeated Confederates. He was one of the few Southern Democrats who had refused to join the Confederacy. That was why people thought he was something extraordinary. But all of his basic political feelings and political orientation were really much closer to those of the defeated Confederacy than they were of the victorious Republicans in the North. And when he proceeded to put policies into place, they collided almost at once with the policies that Republicans in Congress had believed that Abraham Lincoln was going to put in place had he lived.
So how did this work out, let's say, from 1865 to 1868?
Well, it begins with Johnson issuing a series of amnesties. These are limited amnesties. They don't really include the Confederate leadership or anyone who owned more than $20,000 worth of real property. But they are amnesties, and they include an awful lot of Confederates. They also include a lot of on-the-sidelines types in the South whom Johnson now wants to recognize as legitimate governments in the defeated Confederate states. These on-the-sideline types, who are now appointed as provisional governors in the defeated Southern states, are almost all of them indistinguishable from the Confederates, and they start to put policies into place which enrage Republicans in Congress. For instance, there's no question that slavery is over and done with, but what did Southern states now propose to do about these newly freed slaves? Well, the governors whom Johnson puts into place, allow the state legislatures to pass black codes, which deprive the freed slaves of just about every civil right worthy of the name. Black people couldn't even own a knife or a gun, much less be able to contract freely for their own jobs and for their own labor. Anyone who didn't have a job, quote unquote, was going to be stigmatized as a vagrant, arrested, and literally auctioned off to the highest bidder, just as though they were still slaves. These were the kinds of policies Johnson was willing to sanction as the price for reintegrating the southern states into the Union. And when Congress reassembled in December of 1865, they said, we didn't fight the Civil War for this. I mean, what are we talking about here? 620,000 dead, and all we're going to get for it is peonage rather than slavery? So Congress decides to bolt ahead and create its own Reconstruction programs. These include a civil rights bill. These include a freedmen's bureau to assist the newly freed slaves in getting their feet economically on the ground. Johnson vetoes every one of these initiatives. And finally, the collision becomes so great that Congress impeaches Johnson. He goes on trial in 1868 and only narrowly survives conviction. He serves out the rest of his term until the election of 1868 and the inauguration of a new president the following March. But between the time that his impeachment trial fails and he goes out of office, he is really a dead letter politically. And Congress is really in the driver's seat in terms of creating new policies for Reconstruction.
What were those new policies?
Well, Congress, when it passed in 1867, a series of 4 new Reconstruction Acts, decided to reorganize the states of the defeated Confederacy into what were known as military districts. These military districts would have a kind of dual executive. There would still be a civil government in place, but there would also be a military governor who would be responsible for making sure the civil governor didn't just do a replay of the old Confederate days. Sometimes these military governors were effective, sometimes they weren't, but they were certainly a way of sending a message to the defeated southern states that there was no going back to the old racial regime of slavery. And they were going to have, if they were going to be part of the Union, they were going to have to start playing ball the way everyone else was going to do under the Constitution. In addition to the 4 Reconstruction Acts, Congress also adopts 2 new amendments to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the longest of all of the 27 amendments to the Constitution, and it contains some of the most important legal dynamite in all of the amendments. It's the 14th Amendment, for instance, which establishes the appropriate definition of United States citizenship. You might think that since the Constitution was written in 1787, the founders might have taken care of that rather obvious detail, but in fact they didn't. There's nothing in the Constitution before the 14th Amendment that actually defines citizenship on the national basis. Well, the 14th Amendment does that because that in turn then becomes the basis for determining who gets to vote. That will mean then that the freed slaves are going to be entitled to vote. They're also going to be covered by the Privileges and Immunities Clause, by the Due Process Clause, and by what the 14th Amendment describes as equal protection under law. The 15th Amendment comes along right behind that, and just to make sure no one made any mistakes about intention, specifies that voting rights will not be, on the federal level at least, interfered with on the basis of race. So what you get between the 2 amendments and the 4 Reconstruction Acts is an entirely new way of doing Reconstruction. It's one that excludes the old Confederate leadership, tries to raise up a new Southern leadership, some of it white and sympathetic to Republicans, a lot of it, surprisingly, new black political leadership. I mean, for the first time, you're getting the election of black state legislators, and then, in short order, black congressmen, even black senators, and this within 5 years of the end of the Civil War. That makes for a very different political stage in the South. And it is one in which southern state after southern state finds itself now governed by Republican majorities. In some states, those Republican majorities are overwhelmingly black majorities. South Carolina is a good example of that. And by 1870, you really find that it is a completely new political day under congressional Reconstruction.
Unfortunately, we need to take a short break. We're talking to Professor Allen Guelzo about Reconstruction. Welcome back to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. We're talking to Professor Allen Guelzo about his new book, Reconstruction, A Concise History. Now, why was it strong Republican majorities in the South, in these years?
Well, partly it's because for the very first time, the Reconstruction Act mandated voter registration. Now, voter registration is something that we accept as such an ordinary common thing. You register to vote. When you go to the voting booth, someone is going to check your name against a voter registration list, and so on and so forth. We take that for granted. Actually, there were no voter registration lists before Reconstruction. Reconstruction introduces voter registration, but largely to exclude those Confederates who, under the 14th Amendment, are excluded apart from congressional pardons. So actually, the funny thing about voter registration is that it really begins as an exclusionary measure. As it excludes the former rebels, it serves to identify and include the newly freed slaves. And they, of course, are not going to be voting the same way their old white masters voted. They're going to be voting in an entirely new way for the people who gave them freedom, which is to say, the Republicans. And that produces large Republican majorities in state after southern state, very largely on the strength of new black voters, but also there are a lot of white Southerners who either were never terribly enthusiastic about the Confederacy, or else who are political opportunists and who see that the Republicans are running the show in Washington. They're now running the show in the state legislatures. Well, if you want a piece of the political action, guess what party you're going to align yourself with? Well, you put all those things together, and what you get in state after state in the former Confederacy are state governments which are now run by Republicans, which are mandating equal civil rights for the freed slaves, and which are gradually then being readmitted to full participation in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And when they do, that's when the military governors are withdrawn.
March 4th, 1869, U.S. Grant becomes president. What changes?
At first, not a whole lot. Grant becomes president promising people that he is going to make peace. His motto, which he repeated like a mantra in his inaugural address, was, "Let us have peace." But what Grant meant by that was a continuation of the Republican policies of Reconstruction. The problem for Ulysses Grant was that Ulysses Grant, great soldier that he was not a particularly effective politician. He was not particularly effective, first of all, in running his own government, his own administration internally. He tended to staff cabinet positions and other important administrative jobs with personal friends and cronies from the old war days. And embarrassingly enough, more times than not, they turned out to be hideously corrupt. And so they brought all kinds of infamy down on his administration over the years that he was president. He's not very effective in running things internally. The other thing is he also tends to be a reactive president. He never really articulates an overall plan for Reconstruction. He tends to react to individual situations or individual crises. Now, when he does, frequently he's very effective. But there's no sense in which Grant ever sits down and writes a Marshall Plan for Reconstruction. It's deal with the problem here, deal with the problem there. It's crisis management, incident by incident. And in fact, he's going to be dealing with a lot more in the way of crisis management than he'd ever planned for in the 8 years that he's president. So much so that, in fact, with the best of intentions, he ends up being witness to the destruction, piece by piece, of a lot of the Reconstruction governments.
What are the failures that are happening then to overturn Reconstruction during the Grant administration?
Well, one major failure that is happening on the state level is factionalism. Factionalism is going to take place for a number of reasons. First of all, the newly freed slaves are Republicans, but there is factionalism within the black community. And that factionalism is really deadly. It pits one black politician off against another black politician. It'll also create deep wells of suspicion between white Republicans and black Republicans in the southern states, because many black Republicans will look upon themselves as the real Republicans, whereas these white southern Republicans are nothing more than former Confederates turncoat opportunists who are looking to take advantage. So there's hostility and division that way. Not only is there hostility and division, but once you get hostility and division, then you also get coalition making. The former Democratic leadership of the southern states now begins to sidle up to southern white unionists or to black Republicans and to say, you know, we see the error of our ways. We see the error of the past. We do not like Group X over there. You are Group Y. We will throw our support to you, Group Y, if you will allow us to join you in a coalition. And time and time and time again in the southern states, this is the bait that is offered. This is the bait that is swallowed. And you find happening in places like Georgia, for instance. Here you have old Georgia Southern white Democrats led by John B. Gordon. John Gordon plays off the white Republicans of Georgia against the black Republicans, sets up coalitions, gets himself elected governor, and gets a Democratic majority in the Georgia legislature, at which point they forget about all the promises they made to black Republicans or to white Republicans. And they start passing one piece of legislation after another, designed very carefully, very craftily, to dodge federal law and put the freed slaves as far back into a form of economic peonage as they possibly can. It's something that you see working out on a different script in each state. But although the details and the personalities of each script are the same, the result always tends to be identical, and that is Democrats regain control of the southern states, and when they do, they make sure that Republicans are never going to get their hands on the levers of political power again.
The election of 1876, probably still our most controversial election. What happens and how does it affect Reconstruction?
Crank back to 1873 to understand what happens in that election. 1873 is a year of a major economic depression. And the impact of that depression sends voters across the country, north and south, but especially the north, fleeing to the Democrats, because Republicans had been in charge of Congress ever since 1860. Well, being in charge means you're also being responsible, and Republicans are held responsible for the Panic of 1873. That means in the congressional elections of 1874, Democrats regain a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. That means no more funding for Reconstruction initiatives on the federal level. What this also means is that 2 years on, when we get to the presidential election, you have a Democratic presidential candidate, Samuel Tilden, who is able to appeal to voters who have suffered from this depression, who is able to appeal to voters who are disenchanted with all the graft and the corruption that has marked and defaced the Grant administration. And Samuel Tilden's candidacy is a powerful candidacy. Now, running against him, the Republican nominee is Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes is a decent man in a lot of ways. Early in his career, he had been very trenchant and forthright on the subject of black civil rights. But as he moved up in the political world, especially as he became governor of Ohio, a bitterly divided state politically, he began to sing a somewhat more moderate song. So when he runs for the presidency, he's not quite going to do it as a radical Republican, as a Republican who is going to nail his colors to the mast about black civil rights. When the election takes place, it is a squeaker. And, great shades of the year 2000 on the election then. What the election really comes down to is the electoral votes of Florida. Because in Florida and in Louisiana, there are competing vote counts, competing tallies. There's no hanging chads because they didn't have those kinds of things then. But still, there is widespread disagreement about who actually wins Louisiana, and even more, who actually wins the popular vote in Florida. This becomes so divisive and so acidic an issue that, in fact, no one can really claim who has been elected as you move from November of 1876 to December, January, February. I mean, you're about ready to get to Inauguration Day on the 4th of March, 1877, and it's still not clear who really is the elected president. Finally, a congressional commission is created, and the congressional commission sits down to make a determination about who should get the electoral votes of Florida. And effectively, a deal is made. Rutherford B. Hayes will ease up on any federal enforcement of Reconstruction if the Southern members of the Electoral Commission are willing to let Florida's electoral votes go to Hayes. They agree to the deal. The electoral votes of Florida go to Hayes. He wins the presidency by one electoral vote. We're talking 184 to 183. And he is duly inaugurated in March of 1877. And he is true to his word. He makes it clear that he will not use federal troops to enforce the last two remaining Reconstruction regimes in the South. And both of them collapse. And really, that is the effective end of Reconstruction, at least as we usually understand it.
Now, why is it important for us in today's world to understand what happened in Reconstruction?
One principal reason concerns race in American life. From 1865 until 1877, we really had a good, clear, open shot at creating a society in which race does not matter, at least politically. We had an opportunity to put the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution into real life and to say that what really matters when you participate in political life, what really matters when you vote, is whether you are a citizen. Not whether you're black, not whether you're white, not whether you're brown, or any other color. The only thing that matters is whether you are a citizen of the United States. We had a chance to make that real, and we bobbled it away in Reconstruction. We bobbled it away because of the ferocity of Southern white resistance, unable to bear the thought of equal black citizen participation. And we bobbled it away because of mistakes made at the very top by the administrations of Johnson and Grant, and then eventually of Hayes. Now, when I say all this, it sounds like, oh, how could they have been that foolish? How could they have been that stupid? Why didn't someone say something or do something? Bear in mind, Michael, that people went into Reconstruction with no template for it. There was no Reconstruction for dummies that you could easily buy at a bookstore. The models for reconstructing a society torn by civil war had to be drawn from the 17th century or even further back, the classical past. And those examples, by the way, were not particularly encouraging because they were, most of them, examples of how the victor in a civil war gets to execute the law of conquest. In other words, you take all the people who fought against you and lost, and you hang them, you execute them, you torture them, you imprison them, and so on and so forth like that. Well, we didn't do that. And I think in large measure that actually is to our credit as Americans. We did not, at the end of the Civil War, inaugurate some kind of reign of terror. But on the other hand, the price we paid for it was we really didn't know what the alternative would be. We didn't know how to do Reconstruction. So we made mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. Again, not because we were consciously trying to make mistakes, but simply because we were improvising from can to can't in how to do this Reconstruction thing. We just really did not know how to do it. And when we made mistakes, we often made mistakes that were irreparable. So on the one hand, we live with long-term the history of what was done in Reconstruction, particularly on race. It took another 80 years in the history of the life of our republic before we finally came up fully and frankly to this issue of who should vote. A citizen should vote irrespective of race. In between those two goalposts stretches Jim Crow, segregation, some of the most disgraceful chapters in American life. And as I say, we still live with racial divisions that were caused by the failure of Reconstruction. We could have headed a lot of that off, maybe even headed it all off, if Reconstruction had been done in some different ways. But we didn't. And we live with the consequences of that.
The name of the book, Reconstruction, A Concise History, the author, Allen Guelzo. Thank you very much for being on Connor's Corner.
Wonderful to be here.